Good morning. Like everybody's cold. We're thankful for heaters today and thankful that we have enough bodies to help keep everybody warm. I did appreciate your attendance here, and so very thankful that you chose to be here today to worship our Lord. We started a series a couple of weeks ago where we were talking about biblical solutions to earthly problems, where we were looking at the problem of bitterness. And we're going to continue that series this morning by looking at our second problem that we're going to be talking about, and that is the problem of forgiveness. And so I want to say this as kind of a precursor to the lesson. Whenever we talk about these things of handling life's problems, I'm not up here speaking as an expert on the subject. In fact, Clint and I were talking as we talked about bitterness in our last couple of lessons. These things directly affect us tremendously. And as all of us are people dealing with problems, I think we can all probably find that these affect all of our lives, whether directly or indirectly, or our families. And I think perhaps no problem affects families and individuals more in the world in which we live in than the problem today of forgiveness, or perhaps we should say lack thereof. And I want you to go ahead and get your Bibles out and be opening up to the book of Matthew chapter 18. Matthew chapter 18. And while you're opening up to that, I want you to imagine for a second with me two grown siblings who haven't spoken to each other in years. And unfortunately, I wish that were an imaginary story. But the reality is many of us probably have a situation where it's either a family member or perhaps somebody we're close to. Perhaps it directly affects us. I know of these two particular siblings. They were brothers, and they hadn't spoken to each other in approximately 15 years. And the reason they hadn't spoken to one another was because of an argument that they had got into whenever their late parents' estate was divided up. And unfortunately for me, I think perhaps one of the biggest problems that tears families apart is whenever a will is given or an inheritance is given, and unfortunately it seems like families at that point become enemies and are at odds with each other. And I would go out on a limb here and say perhaps all of us have been affected by this at one time or another. And hopefully we won't be, but unfortunately many were. But this particular family, there were two brothers, and they would still see each other. But you talk about the most awkward Thanksgivings and family meals, especially while they were trying to kind of have something to do with each other, which is amazing that they even did. Many families just go their separate way. But 15 years passed, and the older of the brothers had a massive heart attack and was in the hospital. He was not doing very good. And years had gone by at that point since they had seen one another. And I remember particularly the younger brother going in there and seeing his older brother in that state just finally broke down. And it was a tragic, it was a heartbreaking, but also a kind of a warming moment. For 15 years, they had been at odds. For years, they hadn't spoken or seen each other. And at that point, were able to be reconciled. They were able to forgive one another. And all you can help but think in that moment is how much time and energy was wasted. And unfortunately, so many of us find ourselves in similar situations. We hold on to grudges for years, sometimes even decades, sometimes even longer than that, sometimes for a lifetime. You know, we talked a couple of weeks ago, we were looking at bitterness, and bitterness comes from unresolved anger. It comes from holding on to grudges, from not dealing with problems. But whenever you think about it, even children understand this principle. It's not just those two older brothers or two brothers that have this problem. Even children understand how hard forgiveness can be. And perhaps even as parents, we encourage it. If your child is playing with one and gets hurt and, it's hit by the other one, the immediate reaction is, you hit back or you give them what they deserve, or at the very least, you're not friends with them anymore. And so you think about how we are portrayed and how we deal with these problems. It's not necessarily that we never see forgiveness given, but it's very rare in the world in which we live today. Even our heroes, whenever you watch movies, whenever you think about listening to songs and you think about issues, the hero usually doesn't go up to somebody that's wronged him and forgive him, does he? He spends the entire movie getting even and getting revenge and exacting vengeance. And so we're almost taught and brought up with this ideology of that idea that you get even. You do whatever you can to get back at the other person. And so whenever we think about the idea of forgiveness, a lot of times it carries with it the notion of weakness, of giving in. But it couldn't be further from the truth. And so I want you to look at Matthew chapter 18 with me. Matthew chapter 18, and go ahead and look down to verse number 21. Matthew chapter 18, verse number 21. And on our text this morning, the Apostle Peter comes to Jesus with a question about forgiveness. And I want you to kind of remember this picture. It's going to become important later. That's up on the screen. And so in Matthew chapter 18, verse number 21, it says, Then came Peter to him and said, Lord, how oft shall my brother sin against me, and I forgive him? Till 7 times. Now, just stop at the end of verse 21 for a second. A lot of times we put, and we give Peter a hard time, because we look at him and say, well, I would be more righteous. I would have done better in this situation. I would have known what to do. But you think about what Peter did and ask ourselves the question of, how often do we forgive people? If somebody wrongs us, do we even forgive them the first time? And so Peter gets a rational question there. And so he comes to Jesus, and the question is, how often can my brother sin against me, and I am supposed to forgive him? And you think about the number that Peter throws out there. And so the first thing we see there is the forgiveness and principles Jesus is going to give in verse number 22. But Peter thinks he's being very generous. And I would say we would think Peter is being very generous. Because if somebody wrongs you 7 times, are you going to forgive them time number 4? Are you really going to let them get to time number 7 before we have nothing more to do with them? And so Peter at this point being very generous and asking himself the question. Now you think about the principle at this time and at this day and age. The general principle at this time was 2 or 3. And they were taught, and generally taught there, the rabbis taught that you would forgive somebody up to 3 times, and you can forgive him on the 3rd time, but if they do it again, then it's going to have to cost him, and they'll have to pay or something like that. And so Peter, he's very generous, he's gracious. He says, up to 7 times? Is that how often we're supposed to forgive him? And of course, probably we all know the answer. You think about the way of thinking that Jesus lays out to Peter. Read verse 22. And so Jesus saith unto him, I say not unto thee until 7 times, but until 70 times 7. So stop for a second and let it sink in. If you're good at math, you're saying, well, that means he's taken it from 7 and went to 490 times. That's how often we're supposed to forgive it. Jesus is saying you're thinking about it all wrong. You're thinking about it and attaching a number. He's saying, I'm going to throw a number out there that's so high, that's so beyond what you're capable of thinking it's capable of forgiving somebody. Is he saying there's a numerical limit to forgiveness? And we can prove scripturally that's not the case. But he's giving the idea of limitless forgiveness. And those 2 words almost are at odds with one another, aren't they? We don't think about forgiveness in terms of something we give limitlessly. We think of forgiveness as something we give and we think they really deserve it, or really I should give it to them. But it goes on there, and you think for a second, and imagine you're Peter there for a second. And you're coming up to Jesus, and you have a good question to ask. And you think you're being generous, and you think you're being gracious. I mean, if his jaw wasn't on the floor at that point, it was probably at least hanging open. But it was a completely radical, different way of thinking. And as you kind of read down there and you let it sink in, can we think back to anywhere else in Scripture where it talks about forgiveness or what our forgiveness looks like? Whenever you study in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, and whenever you think back to what love is, if I truly love, if I am truly the image there of a person walking after Christ, am I writing in a notebook, or am I keeping a record of wrongs? Am I trying to keep track of how many times I've been wronged, or how they wronged me, or what happened? No. No, in fact, it's much different. In fact, in Scripture, we find this idea of forgiveness given that is so very different than how we may treat it today. And so whenever he goes on and he illustrates this, I want you to look at how he illustrates it. And so he goes on and he gives us the true picture of forgiveness. Here is what forgiveness looks like. If the words were not enough there in verse 22 to sink in, he's going to give us a parable along with it so that we can have this picture in our mind of what true forgiveness looks like. And you keep going there in verse number 23, He says, therefore is the kingdom of heaven likened unto a certain king, which would take account of his servants, and when he had begun to reckon, one was brought unto him which owed him 10,000 talents. But forasmuch as he had not to pay, his Lord commanded him to be sold, and his wife, and children, and all that he had, in payment to be made. The servant therefore fell down and worshipped him, saying, Lord, have patience with me, and I will pay thee all. Then the Lord of that servant was moved with compassion, and loosed him, and forgave him the debt. Now stop at the end of verse 27 for a moment. So he goes on with this parable, and he gives us a picture. And the picture is that of an impossible debt. And you think back to the scene before that, and you think back to the total picture that's going on in the background. You have this king, and basically he's saying it's time for you to pay your note. Your note has come due, whatever you owe. I'm taking judgments on that today, and it's time to settle up. So he's gathering everybody up, and he's getting everybody, at the end of verse 23, he's taking account. He's figuring out how much he is owed, how much he has lent out, and how much he is owed. And he is making sure that in verse 24, he is reckoning. He is saying there, it is time to pay your note. Here is how much you owe, and here is how you're going to repay me. So in verse number 24, whenever he is taking this into account, we're introduced to one servant here. And he brings him in front of him. At the end of verse 24, it says he owes him 10,000 talents. Now, you and I are so far removed from that level of currency, we don't understand the depth that 10,000 talents would be. But if you do the math on it, and I've heard a bunch of different ways you can calculate it, but if we take this simple approach and say that one talent is equal to what they would call 6,000 denarii, and one denarii would be 1 day's wage, then one talent would be worth 6,000 days of labor. Now, as you kind of do the math and realize, well, the average person lives about 28,000 days overall. And so the math there is not computing. He says he owes them 10,000 talents. And so basically, if you're talking about millions, you've gone up to billions of dollars in debt. And at the point of this, the whole illustration of the story for you and I to understand, there is no amount of money, working things that he can come up with at this point that he has the capacity to repay his debt. It is quite literally an impossible debt to repay. And so at the end of verse number 24, imagine you're the guy, and you're there in front of the king, and he's going through the accounts, and you've just been told, hey, listen, it's due. Not here's what you owe, and here's the repayment terms. It's due today. And whenever he says it's due today, well, obviously in verse number 25, he says, for as much as he had not to pay. Listen, who would? Who would have the ability to repay? He doesn't have the ability to repay. And so in verse 25, he says, well, I'm going to at least liquidate what I can and get what I can to help me pay back this note. And so he goes down the line and he orders the man, his wife, his children, everything he has to be sold to repay the debt. And so you look down, and obviously even that is not going to be able to actually repay the debt in full. It's not going to be able to even touch it or even come close. But everything of value is sold at this point to try to at least satisfy some portion of the balance. And there's nothing the man can do. But I want you to look at verse 26. In verse 26, the servant therefore fell down and worshipped him, saying, Lord, have patience with me, and I will pay thee all. So as you get to the end of that verse, he asks for one thing, and he asks for patience. And he asks for patience on the condition that if you have patience with me, in verse 26, he says, I will pay thee all. What is something you and I know? What do we understand? The math tells me and you that no matter what he does, he will not be able to pay back anything even close to what his debt is. And so as you think about the calculation, he says, and the only thing he's asking here is for patience. And he wants to keep working, and he wants to do what he can. You get to the end of verse 26, and if you and I stop there at the end of the story, that is a hopeless offer in terms of what has been given over your head of what you owe. Here you are, and you owe more than you can ever possibly work in 10 lifetimes. Your only hope at this point is forgiveness. So please read verse 27 with me. Then the Lord of that servant was moved with compassion and loosed him and forgave him the debt. Now, if you think back to what we understand and established, he didn't owe him a couple $100. He didn't owe him a couple $100,000. He owed him a debt that no matter what he did, he would never be able to repay. Wouldn't even be able to come close to it. But in verse 27, and I want you to think of the attitude of the master that he has, the Lord there. It says he is moved with compassion. Can you think for a second there, this man literally has just been sold into slavery. Him and his entire family, that's the sentence that has been carried forward. And it says he loosed him. Read the end of verse 27. Forgave him the debt. What conditions were there that he gave him and forgave the debt? What did he say would be the strings that were attached to this offer? What did he say he would still have to do perpetually? Nothing. He loosed him and forgave him the debt. Now, I want you to keep thinking about this for a second and understand that as you and I are reading about that man, that servant, to let it sink in for a second, that the servant here, he's talking about me and you. And he's not talking about a random person. He's not talking about a person there that's just generic and our neighbor. He's talking about you. And he's talking about me. And the servant there that's pictured is us as individuals. Because the Apostle Paul makes it very clear for us in Romans 6:23, the wages of sin is death. That's the only thing that comes out of it. And so you understand, the Scriptures clearly show us the amount of debt we are in with sin is something that on my own, I can never repay. I can work 10 lifetimes. I will never be able to repay it on my own. You can think of the illustration, I've heard it given there. If you've ever, and hopefully you've never done, hopefully you never will, but if you've ever run a stop sign or ran over the speed limit, and you're caught doing it, well, the officer pulls you over. At that moment, you have already done it. You can never speed again. You can go through and say that you will never go through a stop sign again, but the only hope in that moment is the officer has compassion on you because you deserve what he's about to give you. The man here in verse number 25 deserves what he is about to be given. And he's trying to show us this is the depth of sin. It is not something I can work my way out. It is something for 60 million days I can work towards, and I will never get out of it on my own. It is an impossible debt. In Ephesians 2, verses 4 and 5, Paul gives us a picture of this. And he says, "But God, who is rich in mercy for his great love wherewith he loved us, even when we were dead in sins, hath quickened us together with Christ. By grace you're saved." But keep reading in the story. Now we can end this and we can say, verse 27, that is the perfect ending to a terrible situation. And this man goes off and he lives his life in gratitude and he's thankful for everything that the Lord has done for him. But then read verse 28. And you go on in verse number 28. In verse 28, you continue reading, and this is the same story. "But the same servant went out and found one of his fellow servants, which owed him 100 pence. And he laid his hands on him and took him by the throat, saying, Pay me that thou owest. And his fellow servant fell down at his feet and besought him, saying, Have patience with me, and I will pay thee all. And he would not, but went and cast him into prison till he should pay the debt. So when his fellow servants saw what was done, they were very sorry, and came and told unto their Lord all that was done." Stop in verse 31. Remember for a second, this man had literally just been sentenced to slavery along with his family. Everything he owns was sentenced to be sold, gone. This man is now free. what does he decide to do with his freedom? Well, in verse 28, it goes very quick on this. So he goes out, and it's almost pictured as he's leaving exactly where this took place. He goes out, and who does he see? He finds somebody that he's worked with, a fellow servant. You and I may call it a brother. Maybe it's a sister. Maybe it's a co-worker. Maybe it's a friend. Whoever it was, he goes out there, and it says in verse number 28, he goes and finds this guy. He owes him 100 pence. Now, once again, in currency days, we're removed from this. But remember the forgiven man. If we think about it as far as millions or billions of dollars he owed, 100 pence would be equivalent, if you want to say, make it easy, 100 days of work. That's a lot. And that's a good sum. But obviously it's nowhere close what he actually owes the Lord. And so he takes him there in verse number 28, and he goes and approaches this guy. And he says in verse 28, and I want you to think about because we move through it very quick. Look at verse 28. Look at what he does. Look at his actions. He goes up to him and he nicely asks him, hey, can you repay me? No. He goes up to him, it says in verse 28, laid his hands on him. So you and I would take somebody by the collar. We may slam them up against the wall. And he says, takes him by the throat. This guy that had just been forgiven everything. He takes him by the throat and he's holding him there. And he's saying, pay me my money. Pay me what you owe me. And the servant, and you can imagine at this point in verse 29, so he falls down, just picture the whole thing, he falls down on his feet, and he asks him one question, have patience with me and I will pay thee all. Now, if I were to ask you, does that sound familiar? Hopefully it does. Because you remember, if you go back, and you go all the way back to verse number 26, those same words were just said a minute ago. And they were said a minute ago by the guy choking his brother, his neighbor, whoever it is, by the throat in front of the Lord that he's about to be sold into slavery. Remember, this guy just about went away for life. Was about to spend his entire rest of his life. And so in verse number 30, read the very first part of that verse. He asked him for patience, it says in verse 30, and he would not. Was not willing to be patient. Instead of patience, verse 30 goes on and says, the forgiven man puts this servant in prison, it says, until he should pay the debt. Now you get to verse 31, and it's so shocking that his fellow servants, so they're all around each other and they see what's happened. They're so shocked by it, they're so sorry for what happens, that they go back and they tell the Lord there that had just forgiven this man everything that was done. And so you can imagine, if you're the Lord of this person, here he is. He has been forgiven a number we cannot fathom, but he wants his pound of the flesh. Do you know what you owe me? Pay me my money. Pay me what you owe me. And so, if you stop and you think about this forgiven person, we ask for a second, how could a forgiven free man ever do this to another servant? Look at the magnitude of grace that was given to him, of love that was given to him, of forgiveness that was given to him. How could a forgiven person ever do this? Well, keep reading there, verse number 32. Then the Lord, his Lord, after that he was called him, said unto him, O thou wicked servant, I forgave thee all that debt because thou desirest me. Shouldest not thou also have had compassion on thy fellow servant, even as I had pity on thee? And his Lord was wroth and delivered him to the tormentors till he should pay all that was due unto him. So likewise shall my heavenly Father do also unto you, if ye from your hearts forgive not every one his brother their trespasses. Now, as you let the word sink in at the end of verse 35, and you get to the final judgment here that's seen, look at the ending of this parable. And so, remember verse 31. The fellow servants are outraged by what they saw. They go and they report to the master. You get over to verse number 32. He brings him back in, and look at what he is called now. He is no longer a free, forgiven man. He is no longer a man that has no debt. Now he is called the wicked servant. We could call this the parable of the wicked servant if we wanted to, because that's the picture of this man. And he tells him there in verse 32, and he says, I forgave you. When you were pleading for me to just have more time, I forgave you everything. And then he says in verse 33, shouldn't you also have had mercy since I gave you so much? The question is, why are you unwilling to do for others what the Master has done for you? I think sometimes we may be so good at keeping a record of wrongs and holding it against others that when we read verse 33, we're thinking about somebody else. And we're thinking about what we're owed and what they ought to do for us, not realizing, no, he's talking about you and me. And so, the question is this for you and I in verse 34. As you read through that and you understand, do we understand the consequences of our lack of forgiveness and what it means for us? The forgiven and freed servant is now neither of those things. Now he is in bondage and in prison. And it says he is thrown there in verse 34 until he can pay back everything he owes. I remember what we said earlier. He owes 60 million days of work. He will never escape that place. Verse 35. We're going to finish this tonight because we're out of time. But verse 35 gives us the picture of forgiveness and practice. And I'll come back tonight, and I want to leave you with this. At this point, the story is now unmistakably personal. Because we understand when verse 35 is said, that now he is talking to you and me. And now that he is talking to you and me, he says very plainly, very specifically, if you and I refuse to forgive others, God will not forgive us. Now I stop and I think for a second and think, well, if I'm the man, if I'm the servant as described there, and I understand the depth of the debt of sin that I am in, then how much is forgiveness on earth whenever somebody wrongs me? How bad is it really? It's not at all compared to the debt that God has paid us. Mark chapter 11, verse 26, and I'll leave you with this verse this morning. Come back tonight, we're going to talk about forgiveness in practice, how that looks for you and I, how we can have true forgiveness towards those people that have wronged us, how we can put that into practice scripturally. I'll leave you with Mark chapter 11, verse 26. Jesus says this elsewhere. He says, but if you do not forgive, neither will your Father which is in heaven forgive your trespasses. Unforgiveness is a serious sin, and it carries with it a serious consequence. The picture that is painted here is what true forgiveness ought to look like. Come back tonight, we'll talk about forgiveness in practice. But if there's anyone here this morning that maybe is struggling with this, maybe they've had the problem with this in times past, know that you are not alone. And the first step towards being able to overcome this is, of course, being obedient to God. And if you've not yet become a Christian, our first step in being able to work on these things is obeying God, becoming a Christian, obeying the gospel. Or if you're a Christian, maybe you're struggling with these things. Maybe you're struggling with forgiveness of someone that has wronged you. We can help with that as well. But we have to make it known. We have to be able to ask for help. I know there's nothing wrong with that. So if you're one that maybe has fallen short, or even if you're one that just is in need of encouragement and in need of help, know the invitation is open and available for anybody. If we can help you in any way, please come forward together. We stand and sing this song.